Hello friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we're going to be talking about this full moon that's coming up. And I want to talk about it a little bit in the context of the new moon from last month, because we are in this 30-day cycle. And we forget that sometimes when we're looking at the full moon. We're saying what's in this full moon right now, and we're not thinking about the fact that we're still in the middle of a 30-day cycle that was started when we had a very distinct presence of Neptune and Uranus. And I think that we just need to remember that those are the guiding astrological archetypes, you would say, of this particular cycle that we're in right now. And I think it's showing. I mean, when we think about the current presidential campaign, it's been pretty intense. And then what happened in Iowa, which was very interesting because they had this big caucus thing and they don't really know the results right away. I guess they have the final results now, but it took over 24 hours and they've been mocked for not having the results. Well, that's kind of a Neptunian sort of situation where there's plenty of room for spin. Nobody knows exactly what's going on. You have to make it up yourself, and there's a question mark. There's a confusion about what is the real, what is the true. So let's take a look at this chart, and we'll go to the chart now. There we go. And you should be able to see the chart, and you should be able to see that similarly to the full moon that we had in the middle of January, the 10th of January, this is another full moon taking place at 20 degrees. And I think you might remember, if you did see that other presentation 2 times ago, that I talked about the fact that the full moon at 20 degrees, at that time 20 degrees of Capricorn, and the full moon itself was at 20 degrees of Cancer, that actually squared the position of Chiron in the US chart. And I was saying this is a very difficult time in America. And we're seeing, again, another 20-degree full moon, and so this time it makes the moon itself trines the Chiron in the US chart, which is at 20 degrees of Aries, with Eris has been sitting on it for quite some time, so it's really prominent. And I think it's good to realize that as we can see by looking around, as we can see by tuning in and feeling what's going on inside of ourselves, this is a very painful time. It probably doesn't matter which of the 2 parties you belong to, it's still a painful time. And it's a time of questioning what is real and what is the truth, and what if, we have different impressions of things depending on who you listen to. If you listen to Fox News, you get one idea. If you listen to MSNBC, you get another completely different idea. If you listen to the Democrats talking about impeachment, you get one idea. If you listen to the Republicans talking about impeachment, you get a completely different idea. So there is this confusion and this questioning of what our values are, and this, I think, a spiritual impulse that's very important to recognize, which is, what are we up to? What are we really up to? What is the point of all this? And in the campaign trail with the Democrats, you see various responses to that. You do see a lot of discussion of spiritual values, and do we have to be kind to everybody in this country, even if they don't have money? And do we have to be kind to everybody on our borders, even if they're not citizens? And these are things that come up, and I think it is important to recognize that there are some no matter what your political persuasion, I hope I'm not offending anybody, there are some very distinct values that we do have to adhere to, and those values are values of truth, and those values are values of, for example, not separating children from their families, which is creating tremendous trauma for these kids. So anyway, I don't want to be political here, and here I've started out with a political statement, so let's just talk about the astrology and what's happening in the chart. Now, one thing that I would like to recognize first off is that we have a grand trine in this chart, and that is in fire signs. We have the moon at 20 degrees, Eris at 23 degrees, Mars at 25 degrees of fire signs. And this is a very activist kind of fire trine, because remembering that Eris really is a feminine warrior energy. It represents not just any old action, but taking action that corresponds to your deepest values. What is it that you cannot not do? What is it that when you do fully explore what's inside you, you recognize this is the bottom line, this is where I stand, this is what I cannot not say, what I cannot not act on. And it may be that you reach your bottom line in dealing with another person in a relationship, and you recognize it and you say, this is my bottom line. And it may be that it doesn't rise to that. It may be a situation that you can deal with, and you say, well, I'm not happy about it, but I can see how that's going for them, and this is what I can do and what I cannot do. But just being able to really tune in to what you have at depth is very important right now, and it is fully part of this whole cycle when we will be having also Mercury retrograde coming up in just not too long from now, actually, the 16th of the month. So another 8 days so from the full moon. So that's important to recognize. And what goes along with that is we have a very strong presence of Chiron in this particular configuration. Venus is conjunct Chiron, and Venus was conjunct Neptune in the new moon. So it's important to remember that the new moon featured this presence of Neptune. So even though Neptune may not be so prominent in this configuration, although it is somewhat prominent, we do have Jupiter coming up to sextile, very strong sextile with Neptune, only a couple of degrees separating them. So that increases the presence of Neptune in this configuration as well. But what is important to recognize is that because we're in the middle of this this lunation cycle, it started with a strong presence of Neptune. That's still a presence that we have to be thinking about as we're contemplating everything that's going on. And as I was saying, strong Neptune does indicate that there's a certain amount of flexibility to what we're trying to understand as the truth. And is somebody fooling us or not fooling us? Discernment is really important right now. And it's also self-deception is a possibility. You may see what you want to see. You may think what you want to think, believe what you want to believe. And that's a theme right now. Anyway, to continue, now Venus has moved away from Neptune and has moved into Aries, and it's making a close conjunction with Chiron. And Chiron was also very much a part of the other configuration as well. It is exactly 30 degrees away from Uranus, so only about 1/10 of a degree separates them. So that's important to recognize too, that Uranus, which is semi-square to Neptune and was also in the beginning, in the new moon of the beginning of the cycle, is actually very much part of the whole Chiron configuration. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that there's a lot of intuitional information that comes to us, an awakening of sorts that can happen with Uranus, and that this points to inner wounding, so that becomes a strong theme for this time and for this chart. So when we see that Chiron is emphasized, we think of inner wounding. And we do recognize that this is part of the human condition. And they say that if you can see your flaws and respect them and not get all freaked out about it, you're ahead of the game. I don't think there's anybody that doesn't have something going on below the surface of the psyche. And the question is what you do. Do you just ignore that? Do you project it? Do you say, I've got some issues happening inside of me, it must be your fault, somebody else's fault? Or do you recognize that this is kind of part of who you are? Leonard Cohen has that great line where he says, there's a crack, there's a crack in everything. And that's how the light gets in. Just to recognize that we have not a perfect, the full quote from Leonard Cohen is, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I think that's such a beautiful line. I think it's in that song, Hallelujah, I'm not sure. But to go on, recognizing that Chiron is part of this configuration, we also recognize, as I was saying, that Chiron in the US chart is also very much a part of the scene when we have this full moon happening right on the USA chart, and I'll look at that real quickly, I think. So this is the national Chiron that we're talking about here. Excuse me. And like I said, this 20-degree full moon is actually making a trine to Chiron, partile trine. Just exactly, I mean, it's early Aries. It's only a tenth of a degree different, 8 minutes of a degree different. And of course, the sun is making, which would be a sextile. And here's Eris has been sitting on U.S. Chiron ever since the 9/11 happened and the invasion of Iraq. And I've always felt like Eris hanging around this degree during the invasion of Iraq, it was a little bit further back, of course, 19, is very significant because that was a very painful episode in our history when we invaded another country, I believe, for their oil, and we didn't exactly get the oil, but we're still in Iraq trying to keep a presence there. So anyway, it is important to recognize that we do have a lot of pressure on the executive branch right now, which is at 14 degrees of Libra. We do have Jupiter coming into a perfect square with that. Important to recognize also that this Saturn-Pluto conjunction is still active. The midpoint is 24 degrees. That's the Mercury in the U.S. chart. So that there is a tremendous amount of communication going on in the country right now. National Mercury, the media, attention. And boy, there sure is on this whole concept of what's going to be the next presidential term of 4 years. What direction do we want to take the country? Is there a watershed moment where we're making a departure from previous ways of doing things? The Saturn-Pluto always indicates, as it did in 9/11 when it was opposite, they were opposite each other right across the ascendant-descendant of the United States chart, that this is a new time, a new place for our country. Saturn is getting to the point where it's going to conjunct Pluto in the U.S. chart as it moves along. So these are very interesting times. The Chinese saying is appropriate, may you be born in interesting times. And we do have a great deal of that going on. And there's a certain amount of surprise in the air right now as far as the U.S. situation with transiting Mercury coming to be a perfect square, a partile square with the Uranus in the U.S. chart, which is sudden events. So there's a lot of surprises, things that we didn't expect that have been happening. Of course, this is just in this full moon, so that we're talking about this weekend. So there could be more surprises in store. So I think that's most of what I wanted to say about this full moon. It is important to recognize, here's Saturn-Pluto, that we are in the midst of Saturn-Pluto in January. This is fading away because Saturn is moving beyond Pluto, but it will retrograde after it gets into Aquarius. It will retrograde, move back. And in November 15th, it will be conjunct again. They won't be perfectly conjunct, but they will be just about in the same configuration. Pluto will be in the same place, having gone back and forth. And then Saturn will be just about where it is now, and that'll happen in the middle of November. And I think that'll be a very dicey time in this country, as you might expect, when the election happens and the results are in a situation, whichever way it happens, there's going to be a lot of adjustments to be made. And I think it's going to be a very difficult passage for this country. The one last thing I want to say is I think the presence of these two new nature planets is very interesting. The reason I'm associating them in this full moon chart is that they have a midpoint which is very close to the degree that Neptune operates, Neptune occupies. It would be an inconjunct, it would be a quincunx. So taking this midpoint, which is, if you add them up, it's about 34 degrees, so the midpoint is 17. And in fact, it's 17 degrees, 23 minutes. And that's not quite right. I think it's very close to the well, I can look. We can go into the TimePassages software here, and we can go to the midpoints. I'll just show you that feature. And we can look at the midpoints. And that's not the option I was looking for. Let's see. We want the midpoint list. So there we go. And here you can see all the midpoints of the planets listed out. Oh, okay, that was angular sequence. That's why I got mixed up. So here it is, 17 degrees of Libra, 13 minutes is the midpoint of, this is Haumea, I'm sorry, this is Haumea, and this is Maki Maki. So Maki Maki to Haumea, 17 degrees, 13 minutes. And then we look, and what's Neptune? 17 degrees, 21 minutes. So 8 minutes of a degree. Separate them in there in a quincunx arrangement. And it is the midpoint of these two nature planets, which are involved with Earth issues. Haumea more with the recognition of nature as a spiritual path. Maki Maki more as an activist, do something about it, take care of the environment. Climate change is very important right now, and these planets are coming into prominence, just as climate change is coming into huge prominence. So I believe that that is one of the ideals and one of the question marks of what we're dealing with just right now in this particular timing of this weekend. So keep an eye out for that. There may be, as there should be, some discussion of climate change. It is a very important factor in today's world, and becoming increasingly so as the years go on and we get closer and closer to that point where we can't even, where the devastation will be even more dramatic than it is already, and the oceans will rise. So that's a kind of a glum note to finish on, but I do think it's important to recognize that these new archetypes are coming into prominence and they are involved with Earth issues. And we do have to take care of our planetary environment. It's very important. So I'm going to ask to see if we have any questions that came in. Okay, and so I think we'll just transition back to the other view. And I just want to say in closing that, you know, these are difficult times, and the astrology does help us recognize that there's a plan. It's not just random chance events. We're not just headed over a cliff for no reason. This is a planet of harmony through conflict, and we're being informed through the conflicts that there's actions we need to take. It may be in our own lives that there's conflict and that there's stuff coming up. And if we take a good hard look at that, we may be able to see through it to what is really the underlying issue. And we may be able to take action, and it may be an evolutionary action on our part. It may be, as we are seeing with this giant presence of Pluto right now, and with Saturn, structural transformation is at hand. And it may be in your own life personally, or it may be in the culture. It certainly is in the culture. And we're going to see a completely different culture a year from now, in one way or another. So we have to try to do the best we can to act on our principles, to act where we, as Eris indicates, feminine warrior energy in support of what you only deeply believe yourself, what your bottom line is. We have to try to determine that, each one of us as individuals, in our own individual case, and then apply ourselves in that way. In other words, this is what you believe. This is what you cannot not do. So you must act. You must go ahead and take action. That could including, that could, excuse me, that could include voting. You know, that may be what needs to happen in November, that everybody needs to turn out and choose the future that makes sense for what you believe. So I'll leave you with that thought, which is basically an optimistic one, that the future is in our hands. And Time Passages is here to try to help you see into the astrology and see into what's happening in your own life by means of transits, by means of, you can look at relationships. I think our relationship software is on sale right now. And you know that it's available in all these platforms, Windows and Mac, of course, and then we have the iPhone, and we're coming out with Android very soon now, probably this month. So, good to talk to you, and we'll talk again in a couple of weeks. Have a good weekend coming up.